To create some textured and shiny backgrounds. However, you can do this with just little elements on a card if you prefer. I've got lots of tips and tricks to share with you along the way, and we'll be doing these 3 cards. So let's go ahead and dive in with the first background, the leaf one here. This is the most involved of the 3 examples, so I thought I'd go ahead and start with that one, and then we'll end up with the easiest. I'm using the new Altenew striped leaf die background die. This is so beautiful and unique. Now I need to cover a piece of white cardstock with some double-sided tape for this technique. The strong double-sided tape that I prefer is Be Creative tape. This is a great product. However, you notice here that my sheets of Be Creative tape are all too small for that background. I just have lots of scraps in here. I need to get some more. So I have a few other options. You could also use Be Creative tape that comes on a roll. You see me use this in videos often because it's so strong. I could put lines of this up against each other to cover an entire background if I wanted to. But what I'm going to use today is this Big Mama roll of Be Creative tape. It is 4.5 inches wide. It comes in a bunch of different widths, one that's even 6 inches wide. And there is a ton on this roll. I have had this forever and I use it quite often, so it does last quite a while. What I'm doing is putting 3 pieces of white cardstock that are each cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I'm putting that right onto the sticky side of this adhesive. That way I'll end up with white cardstock with adhesive on one side. So once I have these down, I can just cut around the edges with my scissors and take off any of the excess. So you can try this with any double-sided adhesive that you may have. But remember, if you have rolls of double-sided adhesive, even if it's narrow, you can put the rows up against each other to cover the entire background for this technique. So now that I have this cardstock covered with the double-sided adhesive, I'm going to run it through my die cut machine. I'm going to put the cardstock side down, the adhesive side up, and then the die right down on top of that. When I run this through my machine, as I would doing any of my die cutting, the die actually only cuts through the top layer because this is so thick with all that adhesive and the cardstock. So it's actually only really cutting through the adhesive and the release paper of the adhesive, and the cardstock behind it holds it together. Now I can remove pieces of the release paper, just whatever areas I want at a time, and reveal the adhesive below. So I'm starting with just one of the leaves in the center of my piece here and removing all the release paper from that. So I'll hold it up to the camera here and you can see the adhesive that is exposed. Now you could add glitter to this and get a really sparkly background, but today I decided to add embossing powder. I'm in love with this new Altenew Golden Peach embossing powder. It's just the most beautiful metallic color. I'm shaking it onto our exposed adhesive over a coffee filter just to help contain it. And I'm kind of rubbing it into that adhesive so it really sticks there. Now I'm going to brush off some of the extra powder here, and then to really clean this off and knock off all the excess, I'm going to wipe it with a piece of Swiffer dusting cloth. This is a great product for cleaning in your house, but since I don't like to clean, I use it in my craft room. It's a great way to clean up any embossing powders or glitters. It really grabs it all and cleans it up nicely. And a little bit of Swiffer dusting cloth goes a long way. If you don't have that, you can always use any other kind of cloth to clean it up. Now I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. Make sure your heat gun gets good and hot, and then bring it to the embossing powder and check it out. You have that pattern with that beautiful metallic shine. So now what we can do is go and remove more of the release paper, add more embossing powder, and heat set that. I would recommend not overheat setting it. You just want to get it heat set enough so it's not a powder anymore. Because what's going to happen at the end is we're going to heat emboss all the negative space with white. So we're going to have a lot of heat on this in the end, and that will finish off any of your heat embossing and it'll smooth things out a bit. Okay, so now I'm doing this leaf here too. This golden peach, I'm telling you, this embossing powder is beautiful. And so now we have 2 leaves like this. And I went ahead and did the same process for a few more leaves. So you can see the metallic shine, and we still have lots left to emboss. This time I'm going to remove some more release paper from another leaf, and I'm going to add a silver embossing powder. I'm using the Altenew Antique Silver. It's a nice, beautiful silver, and I've noticed that this one really, when you heat emboss it, it really ends up nice and smooth and shiny. So here I've done several leaves at once. I removed the release paper from multiple leaves, and I'm putting on the powder to all of them at the same time. Now, the nice thing about using a coffee filter is it helps to contain all your powder, so you can easily filter it back into the jar, and it also kind of keeps everything cleaned up on your desk. So this time I'm using the Altenew Antique Gold Embossing Powder and rubbing that over the rest of the leaves. So now that I've cleaned this off with my Swiffer cloth, I can go ahead and heat set it. I do every once in a while like to go through with my little handheld vacuum to vacuum up all those little release papers. That is a huge time saver for me and really keeps my desk neat. So now we can remove the rest of the release paper, and this will come off in a big piece. This is the negative space. And check it out, you can save that release paper for another project using it kind of like a stencil. So in the remainder of this, I'm going to cover it with Altenew Pure White Embossing Powder. Now keep in mind, when you are covering a large area with embossing powder, you might get a little bit of texture. It's not going to be perfectly smooth since it's covering such a large area. But I really like the texture that you get and the shine. So this is going to be a beautiful background with lots of texture and shine. Now I always like to kind of push the powder into the adhesive before I heat set it and knock off the excess. If you don't knock off the excess, you'll get little white heat embossed particles here and there where you don't want it. So now I need to go and apply a lot of heat over this whole thing so that I'm heat embossing all of the white and smoothing out the embossing powder that we only kind of partially heat embossed earlier. This takes a few minutes, but if you let your heat gun get good and hot first, it doesn't take too long at all. So there you can see the final results. We have lots of texture and lots of shine, and it's a completely different look for that background die. You could even cut out one of these leaves and use it as an accent on a card. So there is the first technique for creating a background with heat embossing and die cutting. I really like that combination of that golden peach, the silver, the gold, and the white together. It's really classy looking. And we'll come back to finish up this card in a moment. Right now we're just focusing on the backgrounds. So let's do our second background here. This one is again covered with embossing, but I only used 2 colors, so it didn't take as long. For this one, I'm using the Layered Medallion A die from Altenew. Now Altenew released this die a while ago. There's the A die and the B die, and they can be used together in a layered way. And I'll link to a video here showing where I use this. But I just used the one die. I covered up a piece of white cardstock with double-sided adhesive, and I die cut it with that Medallion A die, just like I did earlier in the video. So the die cuts through that release paper, and I can remove the negative of that and save that as a stencil for another card. And any exposed adhesive, I'm going to add some silver embossing powder. I'm kind of pressing that powder into the exposed adhesive and knocking off the excess as I go. Now, you're going to kind of be careful to not really put your fingers in the exposed adhesive because that will prevent some of the embossing powder from sticking, but I didn't have too much of a problem. Here I'm really pushing that embossing powder into the exposed adhesive just to make sure it stays. Then I'm just gently wiping away the excess with my dusting cloth. A microfiber cloth would work great for this too. Now I'm going to go ahead and heat set this, and we get like this silver wire work frame look. It's really beautiful. Next, we can remove any of the remaining release paper, all those little pieces there. I find it easiest to weed those out using the tip of a craft knife or a paper piercer just to kind of hook it and pull it off. It really starts to go quickly once you get going. So now the rest of this is covered with exposed adhesive, so now I'm going to add the Golden Peach embossing powder to cover the rest of the space. Again, I'm pouring it on, and you want to make sure you get good coverage, and then press it all in, wipe off the excess, and then go ahead and heat set it again. Since you need to apply so much heat to this background to get all of that embossing powder to melt, I like to use a cutting board to hold it so I don't have to worry about burning my fingers as I heat set this. I find it very handy to use. So now I'm going to have this entire background covered with all that metallic embossing powder, and it is just beautiful in real life, and it didn't take long at all. If you don't have metallic embossing powders, you could do black and white. You could use colored embossing powders. The sky is the limit with this technique. So now for our last example, this is the easiest background to do. Only part of it is heat embossed. The rest is just cardstock. To do this, I use the Altenew Doodled Lace background die. This is such a gorgeous die. Now I cut this from a piece of white cardstock covered with double-sided adhesive, just as I showed you earlier in this video. You can see that white cardstock on the back is still intact. I also cut it once from just plain white cardstock. So I just cut it from a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of white cardstock. Any white cardstock or colored cardstock would work. And we just need to weed out all of the pieces so that it's all open and we just have that beautiful negative space. Now from that double-sided adhesive piece, I'm going to remove that large negative space piece. Remember to save that to use as a stencil on another card. And now we can take the white cardstock piece and put it right on place. It fits in like a puzzle piece, and we can cover all the exposed adhesive. So now we have that beautiful pattern in white cardstock, and all the other areas are release paper. Next, I'm going to remove that remaining release paper to expose the rest of the adhesive, and I'll add that same Altenew Golden Peach embossing powder. So this will fill in all the open areas between the white cardstock. Now, if you wanted to do something different, you could apply this embossing powder, really press it in, burnish it in with a bone folder, and not heat emboss it, and you'll get like this sandy texture that's beautiful. However, I decided to go ahead and heat set it today to give you that metallic shine. So what we end up with after we heat set this is a very smooth look. You have the white cardstock and it looks like that embossing powder is inlaid, or maybe it looks like the paper's inlaid into the embossing powder. I don't know what it is, but it's very smooth and it really creates a unique look. This would look really cool with a bunch of different colors of embossing powder and just black cardstock with it. But I wanted to go very simple today to really focus on that beautiful die cut image. Okay, so now that I've created these different backgrounds, I want to show you what I did for the sentiments on each to make them special. They also incorporate die cutting and heat embossing. And I've done these kind of tricks in the past, but I have new spins on them for today. So for that Hugs die cut, I'm using the Altenew Script Words 1 set. That's the set on the left, and that set includes love, congrats, and hugs. Altenew also just came out with the Script Words 2 set, which is on the right, and that includes the words happy, fabulous, and thanks. And I'll use that thanks on another card today. I like the font of these die cuts, and I like the size of them. They're great for card making. So I die cut the hugs from just plain white cardstock, and I'm pressing my Versamark ink pad onto this. Next, I'm going to add a layer of silver embossing powder. You can either sprinkle it on or dunk it into a pool of that powder, which I did. It saves a lot of time. Then I put it on my cutting board so I could heat set it. That cutting board really helps me to heat set these intricate die cuts without burning my finger or needing to use tweezers. Now what I did after that cooled is pressed another layer of Versamark ink on it, added another layer of silver embossing powder, and heat set it again. And I repeated this process 3 times. And what you end up with is this beautiful die cut with dimension and metallic shine that is so smooth. It looks like a gorgeous metallic embellishment, but all you did was start with plain white cardstock. It's a great way to get more out of your embossing powder. Now I did decide I wanted some dimension to this, so I die cut 3 more of those Hugs die cuts from white cardstock. And I glued them all together, stacked them together for some dimension. And then I glued that Hugs die cut that we covered with silver embossing powder on top. What we'll end up with is a dimensional die cut with that silver shine on top and white sides that will kind of draw attention to the die cut. If you wanted the sides to be silver, you could stack your die cuts first, then add the layers of silver embossing powder. But I like the silver on top and the white on the sides. Now when I added that Hugs die cut to that background, it kind of got lost. So I decided to give it a vellum backdrop. Vellum is a great way to kind of mute out the background and give you like a focal area. So I've cut a piece of vellum here, and I'm adhering the ends of it to the back of our panel. That's a great way to hide the adhesive. When I looked at this, I still felt too much showed through. So I decided to double up the vellum. So I cut another piece of vellum the same width, and I'm going to put it right on top of the first. And then I felt like it really muted the background enough that I could add my sentiment on top and it would bring it to focus. So if you find your vellum is a little too sheer for you, just try doubling it up and that will usually do the trick. So now I also wanted to have like an embellishment behind my Hugs die cut. So using that same doodled lace background die from Altenew that I used for our background, I cut another from white cardstock and I cut the flower out of it. So I'm going to use that flower as my embellishment. I'm using that same Be Creative double-sided tape to adhere this onto our card since it's such a strong adhesive. I will then use that thin Be Creative tape to add little tiny pieces to the back of our Hugs die cut. The thin Be Creative tape is 1/8 of an inch, so it's very thin, so you can use tiny little pieces on the wide areas of die cuts like this. It really makes a big difference in making sure it stays nice and tight on your card. But since I'm only putting it in some of the areas, I'm also going to add a little bit of that Ranger Multi-Medium adhesive. That's a liquid adhesive that dries matte. I'm going to put little touches here and there where there isn't Be Creative tape. I probably don't need to do this, but I really don't want this die cut to fall off when I put this through the mail. I mail all of my cards, so I always want to make sure that everything is put on very secure. Now I'm going to put something heavy on this and let it dry before we move on to the next step. I also gold heat embossed the message Sweet Friend onto the vellum. And this message is from this Altenew Sweet Friend stamp set. This is a new set with lots of beautiful simple words and a very intricate, beautiful frame stamp. Now I wanted to add some little embellishments to this, but I didn't have anything that matched my metallic embossing powder perfectly. So I created my own embellishments. I took some brown enamel dots. I don't use brown enamel dots very often, so I thought I'd put them to good use. I pressed my Versamark ink pad onto the enamel dots, added some of the gold embossing powder to them. You want to make sure you cover the entire dot, all sides of it, with the gold powder. And then I put it onto my cutting board and heat set it. And what you end up with is metallic gold enamel dots that are perfectly smooth. They have the adhesive on the back, and they're ready to add onto your card, and they perfectly match the embossing powder that I used on the sentiment. This is a great trick. You can also color enamel dots with your Copic marker, but this is a great way to get a really beautiful metallic shine that matches your embossing powder. So I tried my little metallic dots in a few different places. Here I put some on the flowers, but in the end I decided only to put a few around the hug sentiment on the front of the card. Now on the inside of the card, I decided to go ahead and heat emboss another sentiment. This is from the Altenew Beautiful Inside stamp set. I've shown this in a video in the past. Lots of different sentiments that are great for the inside of cards. So I'm going to stamp one of them with Versamark ink and add some silver embossing powder and heat set that. So everything, even on the inside and the outside of my card, matches perfectly. And I will also heat set a sentiment onto my envelope, so that it really all goes together nicely. So here's the finished card. It's a very simple design, but because you have all that beautiful metallic shine, it really steps it up quite a bit. So now let's look back at the backgrounds that I created at the beginning of this video. This is definitely my favorite of the three. The leaf background I trimmed down a little bit, and then I adhered it to the top left corner of a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch top folding white note card. You can see my stacked Hello die cut. That's several layers of white cardstock stacked with the gold embossing powder on the top layer. Now that Hello die is from the new Altenew envelope liner die set. This is a great die set because it has the words hello, enjoy, and for you in it, along with a bunch of stars, hearts, and a leaf. But it also includes a large die that cuts an envelope liner. That's an insert for an envelope, so you can make it look fancy and coordinate with your card. Now I ran out of time to do the envelope liner, but I really like the style and the large size of those word dies, so I used the hello on this card. I'll definitely use that envelope liner die in a future video. Okay, now for this second card, I kept this one very simple. I die cut the word thanks from white cardstock and stacked 3 or 4 on top of each other. Then on the top of that, I layered 3 layers of white embossing powder. So you get this glossy white dimensional shine to that. So you can layer up your different embossing powders. It could be white, silver, colors, anything you want. It really adds a lot to your card. The thanks is from this Altenew Script Words 2 die set that's brand new. And then I just silver heat emboss a sentiment strip with a sentiment from the Altenew Crafty Friends stamp set, and I used that one in a recent video also. Added that with a piece of foam tape, and we finished that card too. Very simple designs here with a really fun technique, a great way to stretch your die cuts